not even coming out of, really just still at the doorway, at the threshold of the NAR settlement. Kathy and I got to interact with, brokers from all around the country and kind of what some of their pain points were, listen to the pundits and speakers from NAR about how they feel about where everything is, folks who are not directly a part of NAR, but are peripheral or affiliates of, and their understanding of the direction of where real estate is going, how we can continue to survive, things like that. So we came back armed with a bunch of tools. Some of you may already be familiar with some of these tools, but that's essentially what's going to be our presentation this hour and next hour. Ela, we have another session directly after this. Is that right? Or am I off on schedule? I may be off on schedule. No, I'm sorry, different thing. But at any rate, what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about, a world without MLSs versus what MLS actually provides. And we're going to talk about 179 things to show why you provide value and 105 things that show why you provide value. So the 179 thing is really more germane for if you're working primarily with sellers. But I know a lot of you have difficulty articulating your value when it from both sides of the fence, right? When we're faced with a seller, faced with a buyer, part of the reason why we're all so comfortable with downward negotiations is because we don't fully understand who we are, what our role is, and how we provide value. And that's kind of a challenge in an industry to where we primarily build relationships. And then, in the midst of that relationship becomes transactional. Sounds like another kind of relationship that I'll just leave silent and you guys use your own imaginations. But, anytime a relationship becomes transactional, it becomes awkward. And that awkwardness is what makes it difficult to articulate your value. So some of the things we want to talk about is actually how to articulate your value up front. Talk about the value and services that not only you provide, but the organizations that you're associated with provides. Again, this is kind of a hit a bit on consumer confidence. We've been living in a world that operates in a specific way for a long time, and that world or that industry of real estate is one of those things. Right now, we're going through a disruption, and a misleading disruption, to put a finer point on it. Specifically, this is so big that, what do you call it? Gossipy news organizations have picked up on it. TMZ, Access Hollywood, Good Morning America. All of these folks have chimed in with their opinions about what's actually going on with this NAR settlement and how it impacts consumers. So if you look at housing, housing accommodates roughly about 35% of our economy. So it's a really big beast. It's a behemoth, which is why we constantly do things to make sure that housing is adequate and that we maintain the health and wellness as best as we can with housing, right? That was why interest rates had practically bottomed out when it was when we were going through COVID. I was telling Kathy on our trip, my mortgage is 2.25%. Do you think I'm refinancing anytime soon? No, sir, not doing it. So, that being said, everybody piped in and, kind of said that, realtors are slashing their prices, or, they were ordered to reduce the amount that they charge consumers, things like that, which gave an unrealistic or an artificial view of what's actually happening in this settlement and why the settlement happened and what the tenet of the lawsuit was, or what the basis of the lawsuit was, which had nothing to do with our pricing structure. But, consumers are now going, I knew I'd been overcharged, things like that. So, part of what we do as we start to look at our value is to really start to educate or re-educate the public as to what it is that we actually do and what kind of function do we actually provide. And no, I'm not overcharging you for services. In a world that exists right now, there are $200 attorneys and there are $2,000 attorneys or more. And it's just a difference of what they actually provide and what their outcomes are with the services that they provide. So, you're still going to have discount cutthroat realtors that exist, or real estate professionals. Who knows? There may be a name change in the future. You never know. But you're still going to have those realtors who walk the margin of barely in the business, but I'm going to try and get a nickel if I can get a nickel. And then you're going to have those realtors who provide excellent service and value that charge more. That has always existed. That will always exist. That's free trade. That's what's known as free trade. So when we talk about local MLSs and local MLS broker marketplaces in action, what is it that MLSs really do? That's been a question for a lot of people for a long time. We know that the MLS is a repository of houses that we as practitioners have access to, so that we can evaluate and understand what that product is, so that we can begin to solicit a consumer towards that product, right? We have a listing agent or a seller representative. And I want you guys to be mindful of some of the language changes I'm going to introduce today. Listing agents should really be called seller representatives, and buyer's agents should be called buyer representatives, particularly in the new landscape when we're looking at how compensation, thanks, Kathy. When we're looking at how compensation is going to be distributed to us for our product and service, we may want to start to embrace some of the difference in naming convention. It's not mandatory, but I'm just kind of giving you guys some cues and some clues for when you start to talk to the general public. For instance, me as your buyer representative, Janet, these are the things that I'm going to do for you. Me as your buyer seller representative, Ela, these are the things I'm going to do for you. It gives more, to me, it gives more confidence to that consumer. It really, just by that statement alone, defines what you're going to do. I'm representing you, right? That's one of those battles, one of those steps right away. Has anybody ever worked with a buyer that buyer is working with 6 other like you, right? And going to decide which one does the best job? That's because that buyer, I believe, doesn't fully understand this person is representing your best interest. They're fully representing you in this transaction and keeping you safe from harm financially. So once we start, that's just a very basic notion of what we do. And so once we actually start to understand that and can communicate that clearly to our buyers and our sellers, I think that's going to go a long way in helping them to understand exactly what value you bring to the table. So we know that the MLS, is a repository of homes. It's the largest database of property that's available for sale, rent, lease. Certainly, even third-party systems, Zillow, Trulia, Redfin, think of any other ones that are aggregate sites to where consumers can have access to that same data that we do. They draw from our database, which is whole and part the multiple listing services. I think back in the day when the internet was just coming online, we made a critical mistake in allowing access to the general public, but we thought it was going to make our jobs, our lives easier if, hey, we can put this online and everybody can see it in real time. It's going to, streamline the process. And all it did was really fracture our relationships that we've created with our customers over time. So in a world without the MLS, there would be no centralized source of available homes, which is, in a sense, what some of the fear that practitioners are going through right now. They're saying, well, wait a minute, if I can't advertise what what I'm cooperating as far as compensation looks like in this repository, how is somebody going to know? everybody's familiar with clear cooperation. In other words, if I take a listing today, I have to put it on the MLS within a certain amount of time so that everyone has access to it, right? It's free and open to everybody and not just me and my cronies. I think you're going to start to see fundamental changes in clear cooperation and the participation rule, even though it's not announced right now through NAR and NAR's representatives. There's no way it can continue to exist in its present form if the ability to offer compensation is not on the MLS. I think you're going to start to see more secondary networks that are repositories of type, but not necessarily the MLS, that will, under the new ruling, allow for the mention of compensation or cooperation between two realtor parties, buyer representative, seller representative. That's speculation on my part. Don't hold it to gospel, but I think you could probably clearly anticipate changes to that. MLSs have, or should have, the most current information. We know that aggregate sites usually are delayed because it's a 24, 48-hour period of time before that push information updates to their site. So typically sites like Zillow, that information is not in real time. There's a delay as a result of how that information is transmitted through IDX and RETS feeds and things like that. MLSs give us the maximum visibility of what's actually available. And again, some of this process, I firmly think will change. There's just no way we can have this massive sweeping change on one level and it not affect sub-levels of that same category or system. We know that because of MLS rules, that typically the properties in the MLS are verified and approved. So we know that the information is as close to accurate as possible. Future systems may not have that, although I think if you have a highly ethical practitioner, we might have even more accurate information in an ancillary system. And again, my goal is not to drive you away from the MLS, but just kind of share with you what the MLS does, what a secondary system or a change in the MLS system may look like. And this data is directly from NAR. This is a NAR one-pager. Again, equal opportunity versus things like a TAN network where it's isolated to a group or a specific income level, possibly. It's easy to find the agent selling the home, whereas other networks it might be somewhat inconsistent. And finally, a level playing field, which is that same as equal opportunity. So, excuse me. Be aware that there may be some changes. The MLS is still your friend in many ways. The MLS, particularly realtor-owned MLSs or realtor association-owned MLSs, everybody's going through significant awareness of change and looking at the best way to accommodate these changes. Everything is still in flux. One thing we found out is the reason why they picked July as the date of change, or the date that we should start to implement several of these things like forms changes, how the MLS operates, a buyer-broker agreement that's given it to the buyer in advance of being shown any property, is because in August, thereabouts, the class action notice will go out in August. In other words, that's that notice that says, there's a proposed settlement on the table, blah, blah, blah. And NAR's legal team felt as though if they put enough time to it, in other words, if they made its members aware of this change in advance of the notice, there would be a deeper degree of compliance, because part of this settlement is you've got to have buy-in from all the members associated in this organization as well. So they felt it would give better traction to make sure these things are done in advance. the final notice or the final agreement of settlement won't even be reviewed until December. So, you know, this is months or possibly a year more out before the dust settles on all these things, which is why I said, you know, prepare for change as we continue to go through this process. So that's why I said we're basically at the front door. We're still kind of going through and understanding some things in regards to how this change will impact our day-to-day business. Any questions, comments, concerns before I move on? Okay. So I talked about, you know, the challenge of actually articulating who we are and what we do. And these documents can be found on competition.realtor. So if you go to competition.realtor, you can find 179 ways, 105 ways, and the MLS grid that I just shared with you. But, you know, articulating your value in a competitive market. And again, I submit that we don't actually compete against one another, not anymore. I think who we compete against directly is our consumer. Our consumer comes armed with the same information that you have. When I first got into the business, real estate was a very proprietary industry. I'm sure many of you have heard this. I'm a broken record on this. But you had to come to someone like us in order to have access to properties, in order to see what was for sale, or find out the features and dynamics, all those good things, and what it may look like if you were able to negotiate and do all those things. You had to come to someone like us. We were the keepers of the flame. We held all the information. If you look at information as currency, we held all the chips, right? We had all of the currency, and we traded continuously on that currency. So yes, there was competition within that framework because there was a jockeying for who had the most currency. Fast forward a few years, and we released all of that information to the general public. Now the general public has some of that currency, right? There are aggregate sites that allowed them to access that currency, like Zillow, Trulia, Redfin, a whole host of other ones that have been absorbed or have subsequently gone to the wayside over time. But the minute consumers felt empowered to do a lot of the research themselves, to, you know, drive around openly and see what was for sale. I mean, before that, we had the newspaper. So every Sunday you get the newspaper, and there was that big real estate section, and you're flipping through and you're like, that one looks interesting. But it was still our data. It was still us controlling what the flow of that currency or information looked like. So now you look at a consumer is looking at everything you're looking at, minus the private notes or private remarks, right? Not much difference in terms of what's being seen, which is why it makes it a little bit more difficult to articulate your value, because now your seller or your buyer is able to say, well, wait a minute, I understand this to be this, because they've done their homework. They've had an opportunity to do their homework, and again, access to the same information, which is why they're your competitor. And for you, you need to have a step up of beyond that to help them understand, because even though they have access to that information or that currency, they don't always have the ability to process that or translate it to where they understand what it means or what its impact is. And that's where we are, that's where we excel, right? It's just like, and by the way, it's that way in the industry now. So you guys have ever heard of WebMD? Now we're looking at what our symptoms may look like, so we can tell our doctor, I think I need this medication because I've got these symptoms, right? But you don't see us going to our doctor and going, well, look, doc, I was on WebMD the other day and I have all the symptoms of this. Can you prescribe me this? And by the way, I think I should get a discount because I'm the one who diagnosed this myself. I'm just coming to you because you're the keeper of the medicine, right? It doesn't work that way. The doctor is absolutely exercising their skill and their expertise to help dispel any of the things that you may have found, or to also, incorporate other things that what you think you may have might be. That's no different than a consumer now saying, well, I found the house, so I should get a piece of the money. You hardly did anything. All you did was open the door and write the contract. Duh. Do you think there's risk, there's liability, there's value in writing that contract? Because we're talking about, exercising negotiation skills and, understanding what the market impact may look like if we go in it at a certain amount or a certain level, right? And that's what all of us do. So, again, this 179 things, and forgive the snotty runny nose, I apologize for that. I think it's mostly allergies. But, in just the pre-listing activities, we make the appointment with the seller for the marketing presentation. Everybody says listing presentation. I say marketing presentation because that's what we actually do. We market the home. I mean, anybody can list the property. That's you putting a sign in the yard and hoping somebody's going to come. But if you effectively market it, you should have a flood at your door, right? You should have folks coming from everywhere that are interested if you priced it and marketed it correctly. So we make that appointment initially, which is a preparation for making that appointment, right? They're not random. We're making a concerted effort to call in the marketplace that we serve, based on turnover, based on average time in the neighborhood, based on how many sales have happened in a particular area or neighborhood. We do a lot of calculations. It's not just random. Granted, we luck into things from time to time, but most of the time it's very calculated, or at least it should be. We communicate with that seller directly to confirm that appointment. We're using lots of high-level sales skills. You guys have all heard me talk about one very basic close that we should be doing all the time, which is the assumptive close. We're assuming we're already working with you. We're assuming that we're already going to be at your doorstep. And that's a sales tactic or sales skill that we all employ, or we should employ, because that helps to facilitate and begin the relationship, is that assumption of business, or that we're going to be working with that person. We're reviewing and outlining our questions so that we don't fumble and stutter when we're speaking with that seller. We're researching all the comparable properties. We're going through lots of data research to make sure we understand the market in which we plan to list that property. We're getting all the necessary documentation to support our hypothesis before we present it to the seller, right? All those things. Doing lots of research. We're doing lots of research, and I'm not going to belabor all this, but this is all the stuff we do before we even get to the property, right? We do all this stuff before we even hit the doorway of the property, because we want to make sure our consultative skills are on point when we arrive. And then there's the listing appointment itself. Again, we're cultivating and fostering a further relationship with the seller. We're making sure that the seller likes us and we like the seller, because let's face it, guys, many of us will just accept anything we're given, right? It's been a while since I've been on the job. Somebody wants to work with me, woohoo, let me go over there. But the way a consultative process really works is that we're mutually interviewing one another like a job. Right. As a matter of fact, I look at every listing that I've ever taken as my next employment, as my next workstation. And I'm going there just to evaluate, do I want to work here? Is this the environment I think that I could grow, both from a career perspective and professional identity, right? Not all the houses are equal, and not all sellers are the same. Some sellers, from the get, Janette knows what I'm talking about, are going to be problematic the second you shake hands and say hello, right? And so we're evaluating, is this a person that I even want in my business? So it's a mutual evaluation, not just, is the seller going to accept me? It's do I accept the seller as well? This goes a long way in articulating your value proposition, because you're actually showing your worth. You're showing that you have integrity enough to say, yeah, this isn't for me, I'm going to walk away. This might be best suited for another realtor that's in line with what your wants and needs are, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. But all the things we do in advance of even going to the listing presentation, very loud and proud. And then when we get to the listing presentation, We're evaluating the entire property, both inside and out. I'm going to allow you guys to unmute for 1 second. Where in one's home, where does everybody live? Anybody know? And you can also put it in the chat if you want. In one's home, where does everybody live? Where do we live? Is it the kitchen? Is it the living room? Is it the dining room? Backyard? Where do we live? The garage? No takers, no challengers? All right.
Living space?
Yeah, living space. In the living space, where do we actually live?
Kitchen, living room.
Okay, kitchen, living room. Janette said bedroom or office. We live in the kitchen. So let me ask you this. When you're just feeling sad, do you go to the kitchen to cry? When you just feel like separating from the family and spending time by yourself, do you go to the kitchen to do that? Right? When you want to get comfortable and put your skivvies away and, just chill out and you do it in the bedroom, right? We keep all of our valuables there. And the reason I bring this up is the primary bedroom is literally where people live. And typically when you're doing that marketing presentation or that listing evaluation, that should be the last room you see before you head to the kitchen. And let me give you the logic behind that. I just started to kind of lay out the framework is that's where people live. That's where people are most protective of. That is their private space. Their innermost workings happen in that bedroom because that's where we live. So, typically in a listing presentation, I would make an excuse, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. I'm just here to evaluate the property so that I have a good understanding of what it might bring if we were to take this to the market today. I'm only going to spend a little bit of time. Don't worry. We'll look in the master bedroom. Because if you'll notice, when you go on a listing appointment, people are always making excuses for the master bedroom. Oh, I was going to put that away, or I was doing laundry, or I was doing this, because it's that inner sanctum, and they're wanting to show that that inner sanctum is somewhat organized. The rest of the house can be jacked up, because they got kids or whatever, but you get to that bedroom and they're hyper protective, and, they definitely make excuses around that. So that's another way of articulating your value, is helping them to understand that you understand that this particular space is sacred, right? Because we don't live anywhere else. We live in the bedroom. All of the other places are places we hang out, right? Of course, we love to hang out in the kitchen because that's where the goodies are. That's where the food and drink is, right? And sometimes the living room or family room, that's where the big TV is. I'm going there, right? That's where I socialize and entertain. But the bedroom is where everybody lives. So as we're looking at that and understanding all of these points in a listing presentation or how we articulate our value to a seller, it's all these things that we do, including that intimate understanding of, I get you. I know what's sacred to you. Let me be protective of that right along with you and respect those boundaries, okay? These are all the things we do just at the listing presentation alone. And then once we get the listing, and again, I'm kind of, briefing through some of these, we let the seller know. We give expectations and timelines. We explain the process thoroughly so that the seller clearly can understand this is what I can anticipate as next steps. This is going to be the cadence of contact between me and my representative, or me and you as my listing agent. These are the things that help to sell our value. Sellers don't always understand that. And sometimes we're not always good at setting those boundaries and expectations. Sometimes we just kind of let it go. We're so happy the seller signed that page and boom, we're out the door. I got this listing. But it's important to create those layers. That way there's not anxiety that exists. The biggest complaint that sellers have with real estate professionals or representatives is, of course, lack of communication. Sometimes in that listing presentation, we also have to deliver bad news, right? We also have to be that one that's like, oh, yeah, showings didn't take as much as I thought they would, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Here's the good news. Here's the bad news. Here's where we pivot, or this is our contingency plan. But sometimes we're not good at that. So as part of all of those things we do, again, 179 things we do so many micro things within just one category, right? Again, once we start that marketing plan, we're communicating with several other vendors and several other people in order to make sure, right? We're looking at our stagers. We're looking at if the yard is in disarray, and with the permission of the seller, we want to make sure that curb appeal is tight. We're looking at the overall cleanliness. How do we market it to the neighbors? How can we be least disruptive to the seller and or the neighborhood? How can we also facilitate additional potential business in that neighborhood with the understanding and permission of the seller? So it's a lot of things that you guys do on a daily basis, each and every time you interact. And again, I'm skipping around through things because I think you all recognize the things you do. Once it gets to offers, that's when our value really ramps up, right? Just to review an offer is a very complex process. I know many of you think, oh, it's simple, and that's only because you've done it for a while. But just to review an offer or multiple offers, any of you ever do a multiple offer situation? I'm sure most of you have. That's a very complex kind of a thing. How are you evaluating which offer is better than the next? Right? Are you minimizing the data like name and maybe ethnic or racial information so that the seller can make a clear choice, not based on anything other than what's being offered financially? So there's a lot of effort, a lot of skill that goes into reviewing offers and presenting those offers to the seller so that the seller clearly can recognize you've made my job easy. The truth is the way we articulate value is we don't make our customers work. Many of you make your customers work. That's why I've never been a fan of those drip campaigns to where you're just sending out everything that's basically for sale on the market, and then you're telling them to call you. The drip campaigns were great when we were super busy. If I've got so many customers and I'm a solo practitioner, in other words, I don't have a buyer's agent or any assistant that's working for me, drip campaigns were a savior because it allowed me to communicate in a way that was a little bit more automated, and I could still maintain a touch with that person even though I was busy with other customers. That was great then, but most of us aren't that busy, and we use it as a primary tool versus what it was meant for, which is a secondary tool. So we're doing all of this great communication, we're doing all this great reach out, we're showing them how to navigate through an offer. But again, our primary goal is to not make our customers work. That's the best way you can articulate value. Why would your seller or your buyer want to take on another full-time job, right? And that's essentially what we do when we have them doing things other than what's germane to understanding what the property is itself, right? So don't make your customers work. Constantly show them a concierge experience or that high-level experience to where they're like, oh my God, that was great. Again, what's the reason we stay at 4- and 5-star hotels? Because you can just relax, right? You know, everything's taken care of. If I want a sandwich in the middle of the night, all I have to do is pick up the phone and it's at my door within a half an hour, right? Navigating through contracts. Again, understanding just the language itself is very different to a consumer. Imagine this. And you've all seen FSBOs, or maybe some of you worked with FSBOs for sale by owners. So as we have these compensation discussions even more and more, and they become more prolific, imagine this. They're saying, well, why should I pay you? I shouldn't have to pay you. All right, well, here you go. Here's a bunch of contracts. I'm going to charge $1,000 for the contract. Good luck. See you later. There would be chaos. Now, granted, there's some people who could navigate. I mean, it's not rocket science per se, but there's some complexity to all of this, all of the contracts. That's why we carry E&O insurance. It's the things we say, the things we do, or the things we fail to say and do, right? It's meant to protect us in that way. But imagine people just kind of running willy-nilly. Everybody's got a different version of a contract, and they're interpreting clauses and phrases to mean something different. The courts would be jam-packed with lawsuits because, again, while they have access to that stuff, they don't know how to use it. It took all of you time to learn how to use it, even once you were licensed, right? And some of you are still learning how to use it. We're always learning how to use these forms. What does this form mean? What does it say? What does it do? It's a constant battle. And any kind of financial or quasi-legal service, it's a fluid experience. We're constantly adjusting to language and what those things mean. And we're consulting with others to make sure our interpretations and our knowledge and understanding is correct. So to give that to a consumer, you know, wow, we are just asking for trouble, in my opinion. And consumers are going to drive off the rail. I mean, most consumers don't even read the contracts they sign. So let alone are they going to read these things to get a full breadth and understanding of what they actually mean and their utility and what they do. So we ease that burden for consumers every single day. So when you're talking about articulating your value and what it is that you actually do, if I were to say anything, just the interpretation of contracts and navigating you through that successfully in the offer process, all by themselves are worth their weight in gold. And I think most of you would agree with that. Things like inspections. Is the house really up to snuff? You know, thank God for the transfer disclosure statement, right? When the transfer disclosure statement actually came online around 1980, that was based on a lawsuit that had happened in 1966 with Coldwell Banker and a homeowner. And, you know, before that, you know, it wasn't necessary, or people weren't disclosing everything that they knew about the property. They were like, you know, it was kind of a buyer beware thing. But yes, I will give these forms out, but you can also access them at competition.realtor. Everything that I'm sharing today is on that site, competition.realtor. You can also access facts, FACTS.realtor, which will also give you some of the latest update as to the settlement and things that were processed during the settlement and things that we can anticipate. Dealing with inspectors and lenders. Boy, you know, that's also a challenge. You're dealing with other professionals, and then you're taking that information that you receive. Sure, I can put those links in the chat. You're taking that information that you receive, and you are translating that. You're translating that to your consumer so that, again, we're making them not work. Competition.realtor. Give me just a second, guys. I'm putting this in the chat. Competition.realtor and facts, FACTS.realtor. Okay. And you can get, you know, these documents directly into your hands. Yeah, so dealing with home inspectors, the appraisal process itself, you know, the process for closing, not to mention the endless hours of hand-holding. Guys, we do a lot of emotional soothing as we go through this process for both our buyers and sellers, because it's a very life-altering event to buy or to sell a property. And there's lots of anxiety, lots of emotion around it, particularly those who are selling, who've been there for a while. This is where little Bobby, little Jimmy, you know, little Kathy were raised. This, you know, oh my God, we had lots of happy memories in this. You know, you're helping people to transition and move on in an effective way to where they still feel whole and happy. That's a skill, guys, right? I worked in psychiatry before I got into real estate, and dealing with the human psyche, dealing with this human emotion, that's a very big challenge. It's a big challenge. That's what you all do every day when you go through the process of developing relationships, is you're looking at how someone reacts or responds to change. Managing change is a very big beast to manage, and most of you do it very successfully. I mean, very few of you walked away with pissed off sellers or buyers. Now, granted, there's that subset of people that are always going to be pissed off no matter what we do. But most of the time, we walk away with people singing our praises, and really happy and wanting to refer their friends and family because you did such a great job. So as you get comfortable with actually understanding what we do in this 179 and 105 way thing is a really great way for you to refresh who we are, what we do, and understand your value. It goes a long way when you're presenting to your buyer or your seller. By the way, I did mention this before. If you're primarily working with buyers, as we look at going forward, the presentation process is going to be remarkably similar to what you already do when you go on a listing presentation. I would challenge each and every one of you to tune your buyer's presentation pitch similarly to what you would do as a listing presentation, so that A, you can help the buyer to understand, and it's going to make the conversation of compensation a million times easier. What our buyer presentations look like right now are, okay, you want to see this? Okay, great, right? We don't do much more than that. Have you been pre-approved? You know, you're doing those kinds of things. And that's only because right now some of us believe that the buyer's not really paying us anything. It comes from the seller. But the reality is it's the buyer's money that actually finances the whole deal, right? So we haven't had to really challenge a buyer or articulate anything that we do to a buyer other than, I'm going to work real hard for you and I'm going to find what you want and blah, blah, blah. And that's not really us articulating our value. That's just kind of us following where someone wants to go versus helping to lead them to where they need to be. May, I think you had a question? No, maybe not. And is that Lila? Lila, I dropped the links in the chat that actually will take you to where this information, the information I'm sharing is housed. Other questions, guys? I don't think I'm going to go over the 105 thing. I'll touch on it briefly, but many of the things I shared in the seller side is also in the buyer side. And again, I think these things are great. We've not had to do this openly before. I mean, some of you have. Some of you are phenomenal practitioners, and you've had presentation skills on both sides of the house for quite some time. But just think about the dynamics that it takes to build a relationship to where someone knows you, likes you, trusts you, believes in the information that you're sharing, and wants to move forward with you. That's a lot of work, guys. It sounds simple because you've done it for a minute, but it's a lot of work. It's a challenge to do it and to do it well. So look at the fact that we spend endless hours of counseling, not cancel. We spend endless hours of counseling to our customers so that, again, they understand what the market is. Go ahead, May. You had your hand up. Go ahead and unmute your mic, May. May? You want to put your question in the chat, May, if you're not able to unmute?
Okay, yes, I got it. I got it. I see the link already. Thank you very much.
Okay. Did you have a question, May?
Oh, this is May.
Yes. Did you have a question?
No, I just.
Okay. The education and preparation of the buyer. The truth is, you want to have a well-prepared buyer before you even take them in your car or meet them at a property. Part of the establishment of that, which is why I agree with having a buyer sign a buyer-broker agreement in advance of seeing a property, is it's a committal process. Remember, I said this is a bilateral experience. You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. And it's not an automatic, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I may not be the best practitioner for you. You may want to find someone else who might be more in line with your needs, but my services are this, and that might be at a higher level than what you're looking for, right? To be able to have that accountability, particularly with a buyer, is critical at this juncture when you're talking about building and growing your businesses. So the better we educate that buyer so that they understand what they're getting into, the definition of expectations of what they can expect, and and why they can expect those particular things, both from you and what you expect from them, giving them realistic expectations of what the market is doing, right? That's even more critical than anything. Some of us have worked with buyers that will go and look at a $1 million house, let's call it, and they're like, well, I like the house, but I don't think it's worth $1 million. Let's go in at 800 and see what they do. Let's just see what they do. Me posing that question, how many of you would say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, sure, I could do that, but here's why we won't? Right? How many of you would feel comfortable saying, here's why we won't? Most of you would say, you would either worry about your professional your professional reputation. God, that word just jumped right out of my brain. Your professional reputation. You would worry about, what's somebody going to think of you if I go at that price versus, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. I would love to be able to get you this property at this price, but here's why I don't believe the seller would accept this offer. And then you give them facts and statistics as to what that neighborhood may be trading for, the condition of the property that you're speaking about as a whole, and why its value is supported at whatever price it may be listed at. Your buyer will respect you infinitely more than you just kind of rolling over. And certainly we've all had those buyers. If you don't write this offer for me at this price, I'll find someone else. And then we end up giving in and, doing that. But that actually damages your brand. It damages your brand because you know what that property should sell for. I've had to do that many times. Jennifer, go ahead and unmute for a second and share that with us, if you don't mind.
Trying to figure out the phone thing here. Yeah, I actually had clients that were very, very, very adamant about, you're going to do this for me and you're going to do that, and this is why. And I said, well, actually, let me explain the situation. And it wasn't an area where the homes, they were trying to get something for nothing, like most buyers. And it was an area where, and I live in a very rural area here in Lake County, California. And the neighborhood they were looking in did not support those comps and those prices. And so I had to have that conversation with them of, this neighborhood doesn't support that, and this is why. And then once I explained that, they were like, oh, okay, well then what would be fair? Right. And then it was like it adjusted their mindset to understand that what they were asking for was not even realistic. Right. And then the other situation I had, buyers were like really, really, really in love with this home. And it was like their dream home, the home they've wanted and the designed in their brains and talked about and all that good stuff. And they were like, you have to get us this home. And I was like, unfortunately, I will not be able to represent you. And we have one of the brokers up here that is already kind of is doing what the East Coast did and gives sellers the option of 3 different tiers. And one of those tiers includes paying the buyer's agent $1. And so I explained to my clients that it's not worth it for me to write the purchase agreement and spend the time and effort and inspections and this, that, and the other for $1. Yeah. And they agreed, and they decided that there was no way that they wanted to go forward if I wasn't representing them because of the way I explained it and the time I took to explain it. Right. You explained why you deserve to get paid your worth. For sure. Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I've said this before. Thank you for sharing, Jennifer. I've said this before, which is, guys, you have to be very careful with how you proceed with acquiring a customer going forward. The reason being is we establish agency almost immediately. In other words, the minute a conversation becomes less than casual, that's the establishment of agency. We know that agency is a fiduciary responsibility. It's a relationship of trust, care, skill, diligence, obedience, accounting for all monies. That's our fiduciary obligation when we establish agency. And so an example of the establishment of agency is you meet Joe Stranger, and Joe Stranger says, hey, how's the real estate market? And you say the real estate market is fantastic.
And they're like, oh, okay, well, I've heard it was this. Yep, that may be true in some markets, but we're in this area and our area does X, Y, Z. And then that person says, well, I'm curious about this house on 1234 Main Street, or I'm curious about my house on 1234 Main Street. The minute that level of specificity happens, you have a less than casual relationship with that person, and you've established agency irrespective of compensation, which is why, just like with a doctor, you want to set appointments so that you can define and maintain these expectations and control the level of agency that you're willing to provide. Okay, because there are lawsuits centered around, I started to work with Joe Blow, and Joe Blow was advising me this way, and then they disappeared. And Joe Blow is thinking, well, wait a minute, I never signed anything with this person. I never did anything with this person. They asked me a few questions. But guys, if you think about the impact in the level of licensure that you hold a professional license, not a certification, which means you have power like any other licensed individual, and you can cause damage, which is why we carry so much money in insurance, is because we can injure people. That's why we have things like a recovery fund that's part of our DRE, is because people get injured, and that injury gets remedied through monetary sanctions, right? So you have to be careful in how you establish agency. So each and every time you meet with someone and you feel the conversation is moving to a less than casual dynamic, in other words, specificity, that's when you want to set an appointment. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, love to talk to you more about that. Why don't we make an appointment for Tuesday, tomorrow, later on this afternoon, so I can go over a few things and make sure I understand what it is that you want to do moving forward. They may just say, oh, I was just curious about that. But as you define, and particularly based on these 105 and 179 things, as you define what you do and why you'd like to meet with them so that you can make sure you're giving them the best service, even if they decide not to work with you, it's going to save you in the long run. But again, going forward, especially with some of the changes in compensation, you want to be super careful that you're not establishing agency inadvertently, and now you're stuck with carrying that person to the finish line. Okay? I'm going to use this as our natural point of stoppage and answer any questions some of you may have. I did drop the links. I did drop the links in the chat for everybody. Again, it's competition.realtor and facts, FACTS.realtor. You'll be able to get some great information, the same information that I've shared here. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to Ela if you have any questions. I believe Ela is recording this presentation, so this presentation will be on the app within a 12-hour period or so. So, questions,
Yep.
guys? Comments? Awesome. Well, if nobody has anything else they want to add or anything they'd want to say, Jennifer, go ahead.
I came on late, so my apologies. But when are the changes expected to make for the buyer? Is that June or July, you were saying?
July, mid-July.
Okay.
Folks in our brokerage, we're going to be implementing the buyer broker agreement in the first week of May.
Okay, and is that already uploaded to the car?
No, they're still adjusting and making changes to our documentation. So you can anticipate probably every document you touch is going to go through some change right now because everything is interrelated. Gosh, excuse me. Everything is interrelated. So we're probably going to see changes to lots of our forms libraries.
Okay. And I know this is probably another topic, but what are the changes? Are there going to be tiers? Are there going to be, is it set in stone what the buyer commission is?
So buyer commission or commission in general, let's call commission compensation, is 100% negotiable. It's going to remain 100% negotiable. So there's not going to be an amount, right? Because that's what you as a practitioner charge. It's 100% negotiable.
So instead of the 6%, 3 to buyer, 3 to seller, it's whatever the
So that was